Hi, everybody. Hi, Mark. We took a little bit of a break because of the holiday and you were in Beijing. How was Beijing?
It was good.
How was the weather?
I can't remember because I think I only spent time in the office or in the hotel. So I can't remember what the weather was like.
Well, can't be better than Shanghai, that's for sure.
No, today's a great day in Shanghai.
Yeah. Welcome back, everybody. I guess a few people will be straggling in, but maybe we should just kick it off anyway. So today's topic, I think, is an interesting one, Mark, is dealing with Chinese authorities. And you give a little bit of a dedication in your book about this topic. So I thought this might be something that a lot of people might be interested in. And just to do a little bit of housekeeping here, this is part of the China Art of Law series. If you have if you've heard of us but haven't seen the previous episodes, you can click the link here, and then it will take you to the YouTube page, or just type in China Art of Law. I will also send a copy of the presentation and a link to the YouTube recording of this episode in an email later. And of course, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat and I will get to them as it comes along. And I think that this topic will have a lot of discussion here. So with that said, Mark, I think the first thing, I think you started off the chapter in your book, I have it here, and you started off the chapter with the story about the driving test. And I asked you, is this a real story? And well, anyways, why don't you go ahead and share with us?
Okay. Well, it is indeed a true story. So I used to work in this rep office of a German law firm, and we had a driver, and his name was Sun Liang. And anyway, Sun Liang came to me one day and he said to me, do you want to get a driver's license? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, like, I'm a bit too scared to drive in Shanghai. He said, yeah, no problem. Just, give me your passport. And I think it was like maybe 50 renminbi, and I can get you and a photograph, like a passport photo, and I can get you a driver's license. So anyway, I gave him the stuff, didn't think about it, and then like 2 weeks later, he comes with the driver's license. So this would have been back in 1997 or something, I guess, something like that, 97, something like that. And I'm probably earlier, 95. And anyway, so what had happened was they just opened driver's licenses to foreigners like a year before, but the test was just a written test. There was no manual test. And so you had to do a written test. And so the written test was like hundreds of questions, multiple choice in Chinese. And so the foreigners would come, and the Chinese authorities kind of realized that it's not very fair because the test was in Chinese and the foreigners couldn't read Chinese. So they said they could bring a translator with them. And so anyway, the foreigners would then bring their drivers with them, and the drivers would actually do the test while the foreigners were reading a newspaper. And so the Chinese motor vehicles department guys, they thought, well, this is a bit stupid. So they made the logical conclusion, you don't need to do the test yourself. Send the driver to do the test. So and this went on for a number of years, and I guess they stopped doing it at some stage. And that driver's license was valid forever. So unfortunately, I had to use it once because I needed a photo for a visa in Hong Kong, and that was the only photo I could get quickly. So I carved it up. But yes, so that is a true story. So I guess the authorities are sometimes flexible and they find solutions which are different from what you may expect.
Yeah, I think different is the way to put it. And I think you started off the chapter with this story because this is, and the book was written 15 years ago, and it's funny because I guess it's more pronounced today than it was when you wrote the book, but a lot has changed, and this is kind of like a lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same. And we'll get into some of the differences and similarities between then and now. That's kind of what we do here at Art of Law, and I guess we'll get into them in a couple slides later. But so what we will cover here is overview of the main authorities, the tips on dealing with authorities, and of course the changing landscape, as I alluded to earlier. But Mark, I know one of your favorite jokes here is, and you put it in the book as well.
Again, I think it is a true story. I think it's a true story. I think this is actually a true story. So this was like a typical American type of standoff in Newfoundland in October '95. So this is really a true story. And so the Americans had this big naval destroyer, and the way the Americans would just talk, it's like, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. And the Canadians then replied and said, I recommend you divert your course to the south to avoid a collision. And the American said, this is the captain of a US Navy vessel. I say again, divert your course. And the Canadian said, no, I say again, you divert your course. And then the Americans say, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the US Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north. Or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of the ship. But the Canadian just said, this is a lighthouse, your call. So I think this is often, the immovable object meets the irresistible force. I think the immovable object wins. I mean, people always say, what wins? And I think, we've had over the years so many clients who just are going to teach the Chinese authorities a lesson, and they believe they're the irresistible force. But I can tell you, the immovable object, you can't move them very easily. So
Well,
it's very difficult.
This is a bonus slide. I actually threw this slide in here, and you haven't seen it, but actually, that this is not a real story. It is a joke, and the Navy website. The Navy themselves put it on their website that this is a joke.
Yeah, of course they would say that. The
Yeah,
US
that's what I was. So it gets a little bit conspiracy theory. Like, of course they would say that, but I was doing research on this, and then check this out. So then the Mike McConnell in 2008, the director of the National Intelligence, said that this is real, and he's heard the recording. So maybe you're right, Mark. Maybe it is out there.
I think it's for sure true. It's so good. It's for sure true. The Americans, it's so American. But but we go back. So we have some other points on that previous slide.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to, the truth is out there.
Yeah.
All right. So,
no, can we go back? So we had so, or do these come later? These
these come later. These come later.
Okay.
So we'll start first with the overview of authorities. Of course, there are many different types of authorities. We're only going to focus on these 3. Maybe Mark, if you have some other ones you want to talk about, but these are the ones that we started off in the book, and I think you selected them. Correct me if I'm wrong, because these are the ones that a lot of international companies who are looking to do their China market entry would probably encounter the most in the initial stages. But of course, there are the courts and police and all other types of authorities, but we won't get into those. But if you do have questions, you can put in the chat. And maybe we started with now this authority, Mark, this was not around when you wrote the book. Because it was a bunch of different types of authorities, but they all got rolled up into one. So Mark, do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about what it was like back then, and then we can get into what they do now?
Yeah. So I think I find these guys very annoying because I can never remember the acronym SAMR. It just doesn't roll off the lips.
Yeah.
And so I guess, perhaps the one which was most similar to them was the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, SAIC, AIC. It was so easy to remember. This SAMR, it's just, maybe there was something like State Administration of Market Entrepreneur. We could at least call it SAME or something, but so difficult, such a mess. I feel like it's a bit too new for me. So, I guess the issue is with them, they took over the SAIC's role, and the SAIC, they do, also in the past, they are the custodians of corporate records, which is where you perhaps meet them. They're the ones that issued the business licenses, but they also are ones who do administrative actions in IP cases. And so they have a very broad mandate. And then I guess the CFDA, which is maybe now the NMPA, or NMPA is part of the CFDA, they're the ones which deal with things like cosmetics, food, drugs, pharmaceuticals. And then I guess AQSIQ, they're the ones with the customs, and they check things which are coming in. But I think they're more for the quality supervision. So I think the other ones which we would mention, which weren't on the slide before, customs comes up a lot, but I wouldn't say that I've got much experience with them because it's a very bespoke area. And so we have a customs group, and we just will pass it on to those guys. And then I guess tax is increasingly important. So I'd say the tax authorities. So I'd say the people, SAMR is also, they're also the regulator for anti-trust kind of things, like the anti-competition. If there's a cartel, they investigate all those things. So I think for many people, you will interact with some tentacle of SAMR.
So I think the SAMR, to someone who's not familiar with it, like I think two questions, Mark. One is, do all companies, if they have plans to come into China, will they run into SAMR, and in what capacity? And when I say what capacity, I mean because SAMR's role is so encompassing. There's an administrative part about it, taking in the applications, reviewing applications, but then there's also an enforcement part of it too, where they're actually like you said, for anti-competition, and when they're actually doing kind of on the ground investigations, because you do see some of the authorities' cars, the SAMR cars driving around the streets. So I think the officers are doing some field work. So basically, Mark, what I'm trying to say is, how does from the perspective of an international company coming into China, what does the SAMR mean to them?
Yeah. So I think, so first I think like these ones here, there's some special rules for foreign companies, but over the time, back in the old days, you were always talking about MOFTEC and the COFTEC, which were the foreign trade. But I think over the last 20 years or 30 years, there is more of an equal treatment. So the foreign invested companies and the Chinese domestic companies, are increasingly, they're subject to the same regulators, the same regulations, the same laws. So everybody who does business in China will be confronted with SAMR, whether you are a foreign invested company or you're a Chinese domestic invested company. Just the act of having a business license, will be filed with them. So I guess they're a more general kind of body. So they wouldn't really have the sector focus, although confusingly, like the CFDA is underneath them and those kind of things. But it's not like if you're a tech company, you have to also think about MIIT, or if you're in the automotive space, NDRC and these kind of people. So I think SAMR is much more of an administrative type of body, and it will deal with things like IP issues and these price competition. So I think for almost everybody will have some level of interaction with them, but you probably don't want to have too much interaction. I think you either will have interaction which is very basic, like filing documents, getting your business license, or you're subject to some kind of sanction or something, and then that's difficult to deal with.
And guys, if you have any questions, you mentioned this one before, Mark, in passing, but the Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM. So how does MOFCOM interact with these types of projects?
So I guess they were still in the old days, actually it was called MOFTEC, which was the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation. So this is again like in the old days, it was more a bifurcated system where you'd have laws for foreign invested companies, and the regulators would be foreign, the MOFTEC guys. And so at some stage, this became the Ministry of Commerce. And so, certain Ministry of Commerce will still be involved. I think they've become much smaller over time, and they have more distinct things. Like they will, if there's a treaty dispute overseas, they will deal with it. They'll deal with some elements of foreign investment, but I think over time, their interaction with foreign investment companies. In the old days, MOFTEC would have to approve all joint venture contracts. So, not just the registration or something. There was even an approval process. So I think over time, they've just become more, again, a standard ministry, and it's not really particularly foreign related. They do have some pockets which deal with things like that. They also will perhaps approve, I think, overseas investments. Another one we should mention is perhaps the state-owned assets, SASAC or something like that. So there's lots of different people and many different approvers. If you're in a sensitive project, you'll probably need a number of different regulators to approve your project.
And you mentioned that MOFCOM has gotten smaller compared to its previous size, but I guess one of the things that I think a person who's not familiar with Chinese authorities would ask, what is the difference between a central level authority and a local level authority? Are these, or is there a difference, or how does that essentially kind of work out in practice?
Yeah. So I think MOFCOM hasn't gotten smaller. It's just that it probably had a bigger, or at least the MOFTEC guys were more like focused on foreign related aspects. So I think it's just now MOFCOM is really more for the whole, both foreign and domestic companies. I think in the central level authorities, they tend to be, not just MOFCOM, they tend to be more difficult to deal with normally. So local level authorities, if we're talking about foreign investment, the local level authorities would be very keen to normally attract foreign investment because it means jobs, tax revenues, etc. And traditionally, but over time it's become much more devolved. But early on, it used to be the bigger the investment amount, you might even have to go to the state council. That was, I think, over 100 million originally. If it was over 30 million US dollars, I think you had to go to central level MOFCOM, and then underneath you could get things approved at the local level. And so the central level, they have a more national, because they sit, they tended to sit always in Beijing, but it wasn't like the Beijing local government. It was really the national level. And so they would look at China and try to coordinate what was best for China from a overall perspective, whereas the local level authorities, they didn't care if it would make more sense to put a auto work in Anhui province. Shanghai says, I prefer to have the investment in Shanghai. And so I think it was always easier. And then that would lead to people sometimes even like artificially dividing projects to stay under a certain investment threshold so they could get like stage 1 and stage 2 approved at the local level. So I think, if you're talking about central level authorities, it's normally something which is a very large or a very sensitive. But again, things have become more complicated over time. So I think it's rare that this is the problem. Normally, if you've got a problem if you've got a project that's difficult to get approved, it will be difficult to get the NDRC to approve it. And the NDRC is the National Development and Reform Commission, and they look after China's macro economy, and so they steer industrial policy. So, for example, it's probably very difficult to get an approval for a new car manufacturing company, like a gasoline engine, because I think NDRC would think there's overcapacity in that business. So, so they would kind of block it. And so, that's at the central level. And so also sometimes, something like car manufacturing was always tightly controlled. And so there too, local authorities would pretend that you could set up a car making company there, but you would get in trouble later because you wouldn't get the business scope expanded to include it. It couldn't be included. Your cars could not be included in the catalog, which would allow them to be sold. And so, it's all complicated. So I think the thing is, if there's this dynamic in your project, you have to be very careful what authorities you need. Another example would be, central level approvals for certain like value-added telco licenses will be more expensive and more difficult to get than the local level. And so, there is that dynamic. So I think you have to be very careful what you want to do, because if someone raises the issue, whether you're going to get it approved at central or the local level, that I think indicates there's a level of gray, and you have to be comfortable with what you're actually signing.
Thanks a lot for that, Mark. I just got a question, and I think you answered it quite directly there. But the question was, would you advise foreign investors to approach local authorities first? Then, what confidence can investors have that central approval will follow the local level decision? And I'll take it first, Mark. But I think what you just said gets right to that. It really depends on the project. We have a slide coming up later to the person who asked, where we have a case study about a project where the local authorities said that they could take care of everything. Because obviously they want to attract the project to their hometown, and then they want to do that project. But you might run into problems later where you actually do need central approval, and you really need to speak with the right person or the right level at the right level.
Yeah. So I think things have become much less dangerous for these kind of things. I think in the old days, I think previously people would lie about whether they could approve a project, but we just were looking at a project just recently, and it was going to be a financial institution, and they were thinking of setting up in Hainan, and that's financial institutions are very regulated by CIBRC, and so it was very clear once we looked at the materials that the local Hainan government had dealt with the central level. So I think really it would be unthinkable if some local government would try to give you a license to set up a bank without talking to the Beijing level. Then that's probably not even the local government. You're probably talking to somebody who's just put together something on the road, pretending to be the local government. So I think that kind of stuff doesn't happen anymore because people know it's too complicated. I don't know if that slide which you've got will be about those subsidies and stuff, but even there now, I think a lot of the subsidies, the big promises like we'll give you all these tax breaks, etc., they do look pretty similar. And at least all the mainstream cities, they do actually go out of their way to say that this money comes out of their own revenues. So it's not like because the problem was most tax in China is central level. There's a locally collected part, and it's not really possible for Shanghai to say we'll give you an extra tax break because that's actually the central government's money. And so I think those kind of promises we see less and less of nowadays.
And the last one here before we get into the next section is SAFE, Mark.
Great name though, isn't it? Not like SAMR. SAFE. It's easy.
So SAFE is the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which is, I think for the most part for foreign projects is how to transfer funds between China and offshore. But Mark, do you want to talk a little bit more about how it was back then and what companies?
Well, I think it's not much different now. I mean, I think SAFE has always been really pretty tough to deal with. I think the thing is, the foreign exchange, it loosens, it tightens. It's pretty registered or restricted. So I guess, the main things which I've, felt over the years is that you have, on the one hand, you have the capital account that's tightly regulated. And then you have the current account, which is like, bills of lading, buying and selling stuff, which is, much, much easier. So I think, SAFE has probably got a bad reputation being very difficult to deal with. But I think, with exceptions of a few little months over the last 20 years, normally when somebody had a problem transferring funds overseas, it was because they were doing something which was not compliant, or they hadn't got a real contract or they were trying to cheat. And so, I think it reminded me of this guy once. He had like, I don't know, $1 million or something stuck in China. And, it was for a type of investment, but everything was just brought in. He had pretended to buy tiles. He wanted to pretend to buy tiles to get the money out. And, obviously it was not non-compliant. So I think with SAFE, generally, if we're talking about a sales contract, you can get your money. You can even get a letter of credit. If we're talking about a dividend or something like that, as long as you paid your tax, really, it's not a big problem. Service agreements, again, as long as it's arm's length, it looks plausible, and you paid your tax, I think you can send your money out. There were a few months where they brought in some things, like I think it was about 2 years ago. If anything was over $5 million US, it might be staggered over a few times. And also, the bigger problem was they required, with an internal policy, SAFE said to the banks, you have to do internal balancing. So if you're in Shanghai or Zhejiang province, somewhere that exports a lot, it's not difficult because that bank will probably have more foreign exchange coming in than leaving. But if you're somewhere else, you may not have that much foreign exchange coming in. And so that was difficult. So I think, in China, there's two dynamics. People think it's hard to get money out, which is true. But the other thing is, it can be very difficult to get money in if, you don't, hot money. There's been periods of time where people thought the renminbi would appreciate, and hedge funds and people like that just tried to find ways to get cash into the country. So I guess SAFE has done a very good job of, regulating that. And, and I'll give you just one other example, because I think just to show how complicated it can be with the authorities, we had a client which had a joint venture. We did an M&A deal, and we bought something like 70% of the company. But the second payment was conditional on a number of issues, but the most obvious one was that the company would acquire the trademark, which was quite an important thing for them. And that was a precondition to making the second payment. Now, we had lots of problems because the Chinese entity was never able to get that trademark. And the other problem was the fact that we hadn't paid the money in full, even though we had that protection in the contract. In the SAFE records, it could not be shown that we had paid for the money. And so we were not recognized as, being the actual owner of those shares. And, if there was profit, we wouldn't have been able to remit 70% of the profit. But we got around that problem by just never making profit. But, but that shows you have to be very careful when you're looking at things. You can't just rely on somebody promising something or writing something in a contract. Very often, when it goes into the bureaucracy, it can be quite complicated.
Before we get into this section on dealing with the authorities, we got a couple questions. Maybe Mark, just run through them very fast. The first one, I think, which is kind of timely here, is would you say that the Chinese authorities were cooperative when it comes to establishing foreign investment enterprises or problems with FIEs during COVID-19? For example, in some cases, personal presence was necessary, but in some other authorities, you could replace it with virtual meetings. What is your impression?
I think, I think if you go like to a third-tier city, they'll be very loosey-goosey. I think Shanghai will play by the rules, but be, relatively easy, and also, what's the word for it? Like, proactive. I'd say Yangtze Delta area, some of those guys are almost like cheerleaders. They'll really, really one-stop stop, expedite. And of course, if you're a big company, if you're like Tesla, you're going to build a gigafactory here, they'll roll out all the stops. But I think, probably someone like Shanghai is, if you're big and important and they like it, they'll really try hard. But even if you're not that important, they'll, make it relatively easy. Beijing, I think, is often quite difficult. So we've often had difficulties, like not opening a bank account because the legal rep can't come here and stuff like that. We even offered, virtual meeting, video of him holding his passport, reciting a poem or whatever. And so I think it is regional, and it's even, it would depend on the officer. But I think Beijing is normally the one which is most difficult. And then third tier or lower, they're normally very friendly, but sometimes they can be difficult because they don't actually know what the law is, and they're just applying something that they remembered from many years ago. So sometimes if they're not very used to foreign investment, they may have outdated, or they may have no view, and they treat it like a domestic company.
But to answer the question, I think from a Shanghai perspective, the authorities have taken on have used technology to their benefit to help with some of the process, especially during COVID. There was that case last year, Mark, last year, where there was a dawn raid and a couple of the employees got arrested, and then to schedule a visit to see them with the police, you had to because of COVID, they wouldn't let everybody in to come visit them, so you had to schedule appointments through this new portal online. So there was a lot of innovation, I guess, during that time too. E-signatures are also a commonplace now. So I would assume that these types of initiatives will probably be the future.
I don't know, like 2 months ago, though, I think it was like 2 months ago, the Beijing, I don't think it was actually the Beijing authorities, but it's like the Beijing bank, the bank which they're dealing with in Beijing. They just won't open the bank account unless the legal rep comes here with his passport and signs off. So it is, I don't know. It's not all written in a rule book how people deal with certain things.
Yeah. All right. So we're about halfway through, Mark. So we'll go through some of these tips that you put in now these are all very quick tips. So I don't know how, of course, each of them come with their own story. So first tip from Mark: most of the time the authorities will be correct.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. So I really can't remember that the authorities have done something totally irrational or something which didn't make sense. And I think, it's much easier for people here to blame the authority. It's just like, they do. And people overseas are often very willing to believe this. So I think, so I think that's one issue. I think here what I was talking about with getting the embassy or the consulate involved, you have to be a bit careful with that. As a consulate, you have to be a bit careful. So I remember once we had a Dutch company. No, actually, we didn't have a Dutch company. We had the Dutch consulate phoned us up, and they had a Dutch a company that was embroiled in litigation, and the local management wanted the consulate to write a letter to the court, protesting that the decision that the Shanghai court had made was wrong and was biased and all this stuff. And the Dutch consulate was a bit worried. They thought, well, this is a long time ago. They just said, well, we can't just sign a letter like that. So, maybe we can help, but look, ask the law firm to look at it, and maybe they can look at the judgment, and they can tell us. So anyway, we looked at the judgment, and the judge made the whole decision on one fact. And this fact was never disclosed to the Dutch consulate nor to the headquarters in Holland. So, so the people, the local team here kind of just conspired to actually leave out the fact that they had signed this contract. Everything else, of course, it didn't make any sense unless you knew that one major fact. So I think that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is it's important not to overreact always. And just firstly, listen to the authority, see what they say. And I think the bigger problem for people is not that they do something wrong. I think what actually can drive you crazy and what feels very unfair is it's very capricious. Like I was talking to somebody who went to jail for like 30 days for drink driving. And I thought that was pretty tough. But he said, well, yeah, it was pretty tough. But this other guy, he had it tougher. He was put in jail because he bought a turtle. I said, he bought a turtle. He said, yes, he bought a turtle. I said, well, why would you go to jail for buying a turtle? He said, well, he didn't know it, but it was a rare turtle, and that's against the law. And so I think, you know, the thing is, you know, when we look about compliance or we look at things like that, the discretion of the authorities is very broad anyway. But also, if you look at the criminal law, if you look at bribery or things like that, yeah, a relatively modest amount can be a serious criminal offense. And so I think that's something people have to understand. And one quick point before we jump on that one is, you know, one thing I would say about the Chinese authorities, which is a little bit naughty, is, you know, we've often had cases where the Chinese authority wants to fine a client and they will say, look, I actually have to fine, it was a Danish company again in that case, and he said, look, we have to fine you 5 million renminbi. I said, that seems very unfair, because all that the Danes had done was, you know, is it called an ampersand? The little R in a, you know, there's a circle with a little R in it. They had imported this product with the trademark with the little R. And the little R, that trademark had not been registered in China yet, but had been registered after the fine, but before our meeting. And so the Danes were guilty of importing a product with their trademark on it with the little R. And they said the little R is misleading. So this is, you know, punishable. And they wanted to fine us 5 million renminbi. And after a long talk, we were able to get it down to 500,000 renminbi. And there was no logic to it. The guy just kept on saying, I've got a quota. I've actually got to collect 5 million renminbi before the end of the year. I said, well, why don't you go and get some of the Chinese companies? He goes, yeah, the Chinese companies, they'll never pay. If these guys will be easy, they'll just pay. So in the end, we ended up agreeing at 500K. But these kind of quota things is also a problem sometimes.
Yeah, I think the stories are bleeding into each other, and which is good, Mark, because that's the way you set it up in your book. Tip 2 is to maintain good relationships with the important authorities. And like you said, the range of discretion is so big that, you know, I like this line from your book here: friendly relationships may lead to friendly reminders. And that just gets to that whole story too. All right.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so I think there, like, it's not really, though, I want to make it clear, it's not like, you know, buying them presents or doing stuff like that. I think that, yeah, I think the Chinese authorities, they quite get, I actually still think they get quite excited if there's a foreign face running around occasionally. I mean, maybe not all the time, but I think, you know, I think the thing is, especially the smaller the place or whatever, the more it means to them. And I think, you know, a lot of foreign business people, they never visit the local authorities. You know, they'll have a factory in, I don't know, Sibbo or something, and they'll never worry about building relationship with the stakeholders in Sibbo until there's a problem with the Chinese partner or with somebody else. And then that's a difficult time to start talking to people. So, you know, and also, you know, I think, you know, with yeah, environmental protection's a big, you know, issue nowadays too. So we've got a few clients over the years in Kunshan, but quite a few of them had to move out because when they were there, you know, Kunshan was keen to attract any manufacturing, but they've become much more tough on things like incinerators or paint shops, etc. So, you know, in those cases, the client that had a good relationship with them, they were able just to get a reminder, take some remedial action. You know, they ended up having to move out. But it's better than a fine or telling you to close everything down or saying the fire department's not happy with how close this is. So I think, you know, it's, you know, nothing untoward, but if you have that kind of relationship, they're more likely to, you know, also give you a hint on how you can correct your behavior.
Yeah, that's true. And check the law. Basically, I think this is kind of similar to the Dutch case that you were talking about earlier, a couple slides ago, where, you know, if you're going to challenge a decision, whether it's by a court or by some you know, administrative body, well, you better make sure that you have the law on your side, and also the possible ranges of the sanctions. Mark, you know, do you have any stories where you've met clients who've wanted to challenge you know, decisions without checking the law and making sure that, you know, they were actually in the right?
Yeah, I can't really remember if I had. I mean, the one which I always reminds me of this one though was we were working on a very big project in Shanghai, and this would have been like, oh, when was this? This would have been like in 2000, 2005 or something. And so there was a German lawyer over who had been working on China matters since the 90s or early 90s as well. And there was also the German general manager was also somebody been in China for a long time previously. And I think they kind of still felt China was the China of the 1990s and it wasn't Shanghai in 2005. Anyway, this is a big, big infrastructure type project. And one of the issues was it used to be that certain types of encouraged projects could import overseas materials or equipment without customs or VAT. And there was negotiations, and I felt a bit embarrassed about it because the Chinese side was saying, well, if the law says we can import that, it was the tiles or something like that. There was like, it's going to be like, I don't know, $5 million worth of tile. It was like all this kind of building materials. And, the law was always, it had to be for special equipment that you couldn't get here. And so the Chinese were saying, well, if the law says it, if it's in the book, we'll get the exemption. If it's not in the book, no exemption. And the Germans were haggling. And it just struck me as so strange because the stereotype of Germans is that they're by the book, and the stereotype of the Chinese is that they're haggling. But it was like juxtaposed. So there were the Germans trying to haggle to get some deal. Can you do me a favor? Help us get the customs duty exemption. And the Chinese saying, we will help, but it must be in accordance with the law. So that's the kind of thing. So, I think it's much less than it used to be where the rule of man, like if the person liked you, you could get away with stuff. I think now it's really by the book most of the time.
Well, that leads us to the next slide here. The next tip is be as compliant as possible. Now, I put these in quotes here because I now keep in mind when a lot of the stuff I'm pulling from the book is pretty old. So when I was reading this part, Mark, I thought to myself, ooh, that's a pretty hot take. So I just wonder, what's your thoughts on, is this still the same opinion you have today as when you wrote the book? So just to go over it very quickly, in the book, you said that you have a distinct impression that over the long term, an expectation of improvement in international businesses' level of compliance does exist. This is not a form of protectionism, probably, but rather that the Chinese tend to expect more from international businesses than domestic businesses. So do I. And then and then and then in the green one here, which is long story short, you're just saying that, well, it's difficult for international businesses to justify why it is willing to pollute in China when it complies with higher standards at home, or why it finds compliance with social security requirements too expensive for Chinese workers when they only earn 1/10 of the wages of their home employees. And I think I thought it was a pretty interesting take. So I don't think I'm just more concerned about what are your thoughts on this tip back then versus now, and how do you feel about that today?
Well, so I think, look, I think things have become more like even-handed. I think back in the old days, so I think it was always a bit annoying. I mean, I remember AmCham really annoyed me in 1990. So obviously I haven't gotten over it, but they brought out a paper being upset, and I'm really not a left winger. I'm actually quite a conservative right wing person. But AmCham brought out this kind of white paper saying why the PRC labor law was bad because it was going to increase protections for workers, and also they're going to increase the minimum wage. And I just thought, well, you bastards, and they were just saying like, this is really unfair. And I was just thinking, yeah, it's kind of normal that things happen like that. And so, I think there was a feeling now we can discuss how, Western companies now, I think people do expect everybody now to comply with environmental standards and labor policies. 10 years ago, I think it's fair to say the Chinese companies would get away with a lot more, I think. And I think some Western companies would also try to get away with a lot more. And I think it's difficult enough if it's difficult enough to actually explain to somebody why you would operate a factory in China with a lower standard of environmental protection, say Germany, if you're a German company. I think that's difficult. But if China has a lower standard of environmental and you're from Germany, it's really impossible to explain why you don't feel that you can even comply with that standard. So I think that was something which kind of annoyed me. I think that's gone away a lot because I think they really have done a lot on the environmental standards. I'm sure some stuff happens, but I remember once I was walking, home, and there was the Suzhou Creek, and the Suzhou Creek is a big creek, and it's normally black, brackish, but it was bright red. So I don't know what the hell was in that water. So you don't see these things anymore. So I think things have improved. I think that's yeah. So I think it's better. And I think, probably, it's easier to hit the foreigners with fines. But, if you look at things where foreigners were very worried, like the cybersecurity, these new antitrust regulations, all those things, they haven't been targeting foreign companies. They've been targeting the big tech companies or the big Chinese consumer companies like Maotai or whatever. So I think nowadays it's just expected from everybody, not just the foreigners.
I think that's a good observation, Mark. I think, before maybe you expected more from international businesses, but I think today we kind of expect all businesses to, and I think that's, due to the authorities' enforcement. I have a couple questions here, but I think of some of the slides coming up address them. So I'll get to the question after the slide. The next tip, talk to the authorities directly. You have this story, Mark. I'll just introduce it, but there was this negotiation. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a negotiation. You remember it? Okay, I'll let you take it then.
Yeah. No, I just remember I don't think it was just one case, but there were all these cases like this. But yeah, it always was the case. Yeah, very often in those old days, we'd have a joint venture and, it would be, you'd negotiate with the Chinese and, after 5 days with the Chinese partner, you would agree a few points like, it will be I think you made a typo there, the German manager, not German investor. I can't remember if that's that. But anyway, the key issue would be who nominates the financial controller, for example. Business plan, investment plan had to be a unanimous board decision, which kind of makes sense. Like all of these things make sense, And then arbitration, China or Stockholm, I think was the case, which I don't know if that makes sense or not. It doesn't really matter. And then there was the restriction on distribution. So in this case, it was the client was going to have a minority interest in it. But they were happy for the joint venture to supply the Chinese market, but they didn't want them exporting overseas and disrupting their other distribution. And they wanted to have the financial controller. So I think that actually is not the German manager, it's a typo. It should be the general manager. Anyway, so we agreed it, we signed the documents, and then a few days later, they came back to us and they said, the good news is they will approve the joint venture, but unfortunately they have some minor comments. And of course it was the 4 points that took 5 days to agree. They said, we tried to convince them, but they're very tough on these points. Maybe I could believe the arbitration clause, but really, why would the authority get involved in who's appointing the financial controller? It seemed very, very false. So, so we just said, let's meet the authorities. And of course, the authorities had never heard of the joint venture or anything. So I guess people have used it in the past. So I think, we have to be careful with this slide because I don't know about the next slide, but you mentioned about a bunch of people being arrested. I think, again, you should talk to the authorities directly, but when there's something like a crisis, you have to be careful who's talking to the authorities and, how best to deal with the authorities.
Well, I guess that's what we're going to get into here. It's not necessarily the arrest one, but the next tip is be ready for the unexpected. Mark, I don't know if you remember this story. I can give you a little bit.
Yeah, yes. That is a pity. It's a sad story. This story was good for me because it was a French company, actually not a US company, and the French company used another law firm, a big international law firm based in the UK. And anyway, they actually made a mistake. So the mistake really was they didn't check. It made a type of, I shouldn't say that because I said the French. They made a type of industrial product, which none of us on this call probably have ever really understood what it is. But that kind of product, like I mentioned earlier on, NDRC. So the NDRC does a few things. And the NDRC, it won't approve like investment, like whether they think it's a good idea, to have this kind of company invest in it. But what they will look at is the capacity and things like that. So NDRC can really bite you because if you don't get their approval, you can't buy the land, you can't start the bank loans, you can't get the construction moving. So, if you're like a little company doing, I don't know, trading, NDRC, they're not going to affect you. But if you're a manufacturing company, you have to be very careful. And the mistake that the law firm made was they didn't look at the NDRC catalog for that type of product. If they had looked at it, they would have seen that there was a bit of a loophole. Maybe nobody would have been clever enough to see this, but for domestic companies, they weren't able to make this one specific product. Foreign companies could not make that specific product. Domestic companies still had some capacity. So the client bought the company, ended up with the company, and their whole idea was to start a second phase of construction. But they bought the company, and then they found that they couldn't get the construction approved because that business was subject to overcapacity. And actually, they were lucky that they didn't lose their license to produce because they were no longer a domestic manufacturer. They would have been a foreign investor manufacturer. So this was a few years back. And so that's a real mess. I mean, I don't know what we're saying with this, to tell you the truth. I don't know. But I guess it happens anywhere. I mean, it could be possible anywhere. But yeah, that's something you have to be careful with. So I think when you're looking at a project, don't just look at whether it's approvable, but look at, is there anything else that could bite me? Is there, if you're doing a product which is involving the mining of magnesite, is magnesite, controlled? Can you export magnesite? Is it somehow critical, for China? So I think you have to think quite carefully about these different things.
I think it's a great story, but one of the lessons I took from it is that, and I think it's this slide, is that there are many different bodies of authorities that you need to keep in mind. Just because you deal with one doesn't mean that it's all okay. So the next slide is, which gets into the next tip, which is make sure you're dealing with the right person. I guess we should also put here that you're also dealing with the right person with the right authority. And you had two stories here, and I think
we should really update this wording. Maybe I was less, woke back then. Man, competent man. So we should use person.
It was from the 70s, yeah. No,
so thank you. Not the 70s. It was like
groovy. All right. So I think you had two stories here where these stories all kind of start sounding very similar. These tips do kind of go into each other. Maybe you just want to.
The first one was, the first one was the vice mayor, and so that was a bankrupt shipyard, and we were acting for this client, and we went there. It was in Chengdu, like in Hunan province, and I remember we went there, and we arrived, and the mayor had the contract ready to sign, and so he just had the contract signed, and we just said, well, we can't do this. And anyway, the mayor was or the vice mayor, he was absolutely convinced that he could just sign everything. And it took like 3 or 4 days just to actually have the banks, the courts, and actually everybody else convince the mayor that he can't do this. And so, after that 3-day period, we had agreed, like with the local government, or no, we agreed with the administrator of the bankruptcy. We agreed this kind of timetable. So in that case, and this is a long time ago, as it was pretty complicated. So you'd have to get the court involved, you'd have to get the main creditors involved. So we just kind of worked out the framework of these 3 pages. And, we're just about to sign. And then I just thought, hey, the bloody vice mayor, he was so keen to sign everything on day one. He even had like a 2-page contract, that we would buy the bankrupt shipyard, invest like, I don't know, 100 million RMB, and that would be it. He was so keen. I just thought, well, why don't we get him to witness it? I didn't know what the purpose of that was, but I just thought it can't be bad to have the vice mayor, witness the agreement, because then he can't pretend he never saw the agreement. So I was very excited with this idea. And so anyway, at the meeting, I suggested this, and the vice mayor got very upset. He said, look, I know that you, the lawyer, wants me to sign this, but like I told you, I cannot sign this. It's not possible. But like on day one, the same guy was saying, we don't need anyone else. I can sign it. We can just do it now. So that was a funny story. And the other one is that German lawyer I mentioned before. I remember she was here, and they were doing this airport project in the middle of nowhere, I think. And her and this other guy, they were talking, and they were really there was 2 Chinese men there, and one of them was the absolute focus. The other one was being absolutely ignored. And it was just that they had heard of the word mayor. They understood the concept of mayor, but I don't think they understood the concept of party secretary. And so the person which they were really focusing on was the mayor of the city. But the other guy, which they ignored the whole time, he was the party secretary of the whole province. So that was also funny. So you kind of know in the pecking order, who would be there,
And I'll get to the questions. This is the last tip right here.
Yeah.
But I guess this is kind of, one of the underlying lessons of this whole, this trip down memory lane about dealing with authorities back then and now. And there are some questions about how to deal with authorities now too, which I'll get to. But basically, Mark, you said, and keep in mind, this book is, Mark, this book is not new, okay? So
stands the test of time, Sean.
I was maybe in a diaper with this book.
Should be religious work. Should be religious work.
It's this ancient text, but it says that
ancient wisdom.
Ancient wisdom. You wrote that previously it would have been unforgivable to confront the local authorities and tell them that they were doing something contrary to the law. However, nowadays, which was then a days, most authorities are willing to listen to why you think the law applies, and in many cases actually ask for a copy of the law for them to review and check with the provincial authorities, which I guess would be the higher up authorities. So Mark, what were you thinking back then when you wrote this book, and how do you still think that that is something that applies today?
Yeah, I think they know the laws now. So I think that was more in 3rd-tier cities, and you say we could do this, they say, oh, no. And then you give them a copy of the law, so, it's, I think it's changed a lot. I think they know stuff, they do stuff, they've got a much clearer view now than they used to have.
So I guess I was waiting on some of the questions to get to this slide because we have a question from Ting. We just have a few minutes, Mark, so maybe we'll go through the questions.
Yeah, please,
What's your view on involving a higher level of government to put pressure, if you have a connection there, when a negotiation with a lower authority fails? And I guess this slide kind of gets to that point.
Be very careful. I would always be very careful because, the local authority will be the one you have to live with. So, it would be, yeah, I don't know. Of course, it would be possible, but I tell you, it would be a strange situation because normally, it could only be in a case where let's say you had the only case I could think this would happen would be something like you have a failed joint venture and the local government sides very closely with the Chinese partner, that you might be able to appeal to the higher authority. But I think, in most cases, the authority's on your side. It's going to be, so I think it would only be in that kind of case. That is the only case I can think of, because, there we have done that. But, you also have to be very careful, because, you don't know what the connections are. And yeah, I would be very cautious about that.
We just have one more question. Hello, Mark. Does it get more difficult with the Chinese authorities now due to more Chinese protectionism and focus on buying Chinese? I'm guessing this is more of a recent trend that he's talking about.
I think, look, they've become more, by the book, more businesslike. But I don't think they're particularly unfriendly or anything. I think just things are a bit more complicated. But yeah, the volume's bigger. So, it's harder now to sell software to banks, probably, unless you're willing to go through the security assessment. But it probably was impossible 30, 20 years ago. So I think they're still pretty friendly.
Great. Well, we've run out of time. Thanks a lot, Mark,
Yep.
for your insights. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And that person that asked you the question before said she would agree that this would be effective if you know that the higher level intervention will definitely work, which is probably what you're getting to. Everybody that signed up through the Eventbrite link, I will send you a copy of this presentation and a link once I put it onto YouTube. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for the materials and the next episode. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Thanks, guys.